Welcome to Birds in the Sky, the podcast where we explore how making art and music can be powerful tools for boosting mental health and well-being. Whether you're an artist, a musician, or simply someone looking for new ways to nurture your mind, we'll dive into creative practices, share inspiring stories, and uncover how the act of creating can lead to healing, self-discovery, and growth. Tune in and let your creativity carry you forward. I'm your host, Matthew Crane. Let's fly. Welcome to another episode of Birds in the Sky. I'm your host, Matthew Crane. Today we have a special guest, Brenden Bannon. He is a Buffalo, New York-based photographer, photojournalist, and teacher of photography. He's also a mentor of mine, and I'm very pleased to have you in the studio again. We tried this once. I made fatal audio errors, and that's my bad. So thanks for coming back and adjusting your schedule. I think it's awesome that you're here. So thanks for coming by, man. How you doing today?
Great. I mean, happy to be here.
Yeah?
And try and say as many good things as I said last time.
No,
We'll see how it goes.
It'll be great. It'll be great. You're thoughtful, and that's what matters. So let's talk a little bit about your grand plan for becoming a photographer. When you were young, how did you find your way to a camera? I know there was no grand plan. I'm just messing with you.
Yeah. No, I mean, my grand plan for most of the things I've done is to stop in the middle of the right mistake, just throw myself into life as hard as I can.
Yeah.
And when it looks like something's happening that I should be continuing to do, slow it down and do that thing. So I had kind of daydreamed about being a photographer since I was really young. I spent a bunch of time with my mom in the darkroom. She was an amateur photographer when I was like 4, 5, 6, 7. Her kind of desire at that time was to become a professional photographer, and then she got hit with multiple sclerosis and kind of set her back in terms of having the energy and the space and the time and the will to pursue that as a avocation. But I think I probably kind of caught her enthusiasm and love for photography, and it was, from a really early age, it was something that I always, a way that I saw the world. Like I saw the world in pictures. I saw life in pictures, and so the earliest pictures I took were just in my mind. I didn't have a camera. I was a kid, and
So you kind of learned how to see photographically, in a photographic sense, your photography vocabulary from your mother. So you saw kind of how she would frame up images, and did she shoot landscapes? What kind of pictures did she?
she just mainly photographed from life. She did some kind of theater documentation. She photographed music. She photographed us playing. She made portraits. I think the portraits, there are portraits that she made that were of kids in the neighborhood, and they still kind of have them as like the quintessential picture of their youth.
Wow. Okay.
I do too, So she just had a beautiful, lyrical, sensitive way of seeing the world. And, I thought photography was just amazing, like the ability to kind of see something and capture that vision of it, be able to look at it, study it, to study a face for hours. Like we don't get to stare at each other like when we're not photographing or photographed. Like
Right.
a certain point at which, a stare becomes a glare to the person who's receiving it. And with a photograph, there's this kind of special opportunity to really look deeply at something that I always appreciated.
So did you want to be a photographer like right from the jump, or did you grow up and kind of do other things?
Yeah, as a kid, I wanted to be a photographer, but I kind of didn't understand how do you start being a photographer? I was a kid, right? And I spent a lot of time kind of waiting to be invited into photography. How I remember it was like somebody saying, "Hey, you should try this. Here's a camera. You should do this." And you'll hear some echoes of my own experience in the way that Odyssey was structured. So the first camera I had access to was actually my mom's camera, which had been my uncle's camera Boris Krenitsky. He was in 101st Airborne. It was a camera he picked up when he was in Vietnam.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And, you know, that kind of connection to Odyssey didn't become apparent until much later as I've been reflecting on these kind of origin stories. But
well, real quick, let me just say what Odyssey is. That's actually how you and I met, is Brenden was hosting a workshop called the Odyssey Project, and it was to get cameras in the hands of combat veterans so they can learn how to tell their stories through the lens of art and connecting on a human level in that way. And it was transformational in my life and a number of other veterans. And again, thanks for that workshop. But going back to your journey becoming a photographer and maybe working odd jobs and stuff too. And
well, I mean, that all came later. You know, I always had this kind of dream, but I didn't know how to take it from a dreamscape to real life. And I think too much I was waiting for an invitation in.
Or permission almost.
Yeah, for permission, for an invitation, for access. You know, I saw it as this, it was a goal in a life that was worth dreaming about. So how do you make that real, you know? And I didn't know. I wasn't at an age where I could create that opportunity for myself. You know, kind of fast forward a bit, I was in college at Antioch College in Ohio, and I had 3 really close friends die within about a 6-month period.
Wow.
And, you know, that experience was incredibly traumatic. It was the first time I knew people my own age who died. And, you know, I think as a consequence of that and some other things, I ended up clinically depressed. But I wanted to keep moving. So I decided I would leave school and create an opportunity with a commercial photographer in Buffalo to work beside him and kind of learn photography. So I called him up. I was like, Rob, can I come and work for you? He said, sure. And as soon as I got to Buffalo, he kind of shuttered his business. Things weren't working for him at the moment.
Nice. So high and dry, huh?
Well, almost high and dry. Rob still had a bunch of gear, and, you know, was eager to hand me a camera and some lenses and kind of push me out into the world and say, just go see it and photograph it, and then we'll talk about it. So I was borrowing these cameras, and I ended up, at that time I was squatting in an abandoned house on the west side, and in that house was like the history of America from the Mayflower until the LSD tests of the 60s and
Ken
70s.
Kesey,
like,
yeah.
Literally, like there was ephemera and documentation of all of that. Like this family had come on the Mayflower. There's a collection of autographs in the house. And I told my friend Rob, like, you know, let's make a deal. I'll cut you in on the autographs. You let me keep the camera. And he said, okay, sure.
Nice.
And that was kind of the beginning for me. So the barrier of access for me was having a camera that was mine. You know, once I had the camera, I could make it work.
And that's a huge part of most art forms, a barrier of access, instruments for people that can't afford instruments, cameras for photography, and a space to paint, right? That's huge, and that was part of the Odyssey Project later on, is making sure that the veterans that participated could walk away with the camera that they learned on. So that's it. I like to see that through line there. That's awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was essential to me to have a camera, and in all of the workshops that I've taught, it's been essential to let people walk away with a camera, whether I'm teaching veterans in Buffalo, New York, or New York City, as I'm doing these days, or in previous projects working with HIV-positive kids in Uganda and Romania. You know, they all got cameras that they kept, and some of them ended up using them and creating a life in photography for themselves.
And let's talk a little bit more about those other projects, because that's kind of going to lead me into my next question. But before the Odyssey Project, where you got cameras in the hands of combat veterans and taught us a new language, essentially, for our emotions, You were teaching workshops in very austere environments, refugee camps and in the Congo and things like that. So what were your experiences like doing that? You know, these are cultures that have very ancient languages, and, you know, what was the language barrier like? And, you know, did language inform their pictures? All that kind of stuff. There's a lot of questions in there. I'm sorry, but you know what I'm talking about. Your experience working with other folks in different parts of the world.
Yeah, so let me just to keep a narrative thread going, I'm going to get to your question in a second. But I put my camera down after it was given to me by my friend Rob in my early 20s because my mom was sick with multiple sclerosis. So I spent a decade as a caregiver to my mom and essentially forgot that I had this dream. You know, 7 or 8 years in, I was exhausted. I was depressed. I was spending about 35, 40-hour work weeks as a caregiver. I did the math and figured it out. And simultaneously running a house painting business with a crew of 5 people and a partner. So I was spent. I got to a point where I couldn't think my way out of a paper bag. Deeply, deeply depressed and deeply, deeply exhausted. And I knew that I needed to keep moving. You know, I couldn't stop moving because to me that meant that I was giving up. And at that point I did I didn't know what to do, you know. I'd walk into a room, I couldn't figure out the order of operations, how to paint a room, something I'd done for a decade and a half in my life. And I literally would stare at the walls and need to be told what to do by my partner. You know, what I realized in that moment was that I just needed to find a way forward. So without really having a good imagination for how to work my way through that situation, I looked back at my life and I was like, well, what did I used to want to do? If I can't figure out what I need to do now, maybe I can kind of touch base with who I was before and figure out what I wanted to do at one time in the past. And of course, photography was the thing, you know. And I said, well, shit, I've got cameras. Why don't I just dust one off and take it out? And, you know, I spent a bunch of money buying backdated film at the time. That was the cheapest way to get film and process it. And threw myself into photographing and, you know, created opportunities to make photography pay for itself, and just kept photographing. I was printing at Campos Photography, which is now I print from home. And a woman there named Amy Caterina was like, you got to have an exhibit. And I was like, you got the wrong fucking guy. Like, I'm Brenden Bannon, the house painter.
Yeah.
She was like, no, you're Brenden Bannon, the photographer. I was like, I don't think so. So she, you know, so I was like, you got the wrong guy. I'm not doing it. And she was like, well, I just sent out all these invitations, about 600 of them, and your exhibit opens in a month. So you're either going to have something on the wall or not, but the invites already went out. She was like, I knew you were going to say no. I was like, damn, okay. So I worked with a guy named Chris Bushover. He was a master printer. He helped me print this whole exhibit, about 80 pictures that were exploring my first year back to photography. And I had the exhibit, and people came in, and, you know, it was this combination of like art world people and contractors and friends from the neighborhood.
A dynamic crew.
It was amazing. I mean, just an amazing cross-section of the population, all of whom were people, you know, who had touched my life in one way or another. And people started asking me, like, how much are these? And that was something I hadn't completely not thought of. So I had to run over to Amy and be like, Amy, how much are these pictures? And I ended up, you know, kind of selling about 50 pictures out of the show, and I was ecstatic.
Nice.
And that began the kind of end of my house painting career, and began also photography, and at the time kind of braided in a few different elements that are really part of my photographic DNA. After that show, SEPA Gallery asked me if I would teach in the public schools in a program that they were running. And, you know, I was so tempted to say no, but I was just like, no, yes. So teaching became part of it. And, I hadn't taken a class. I didn't know how to teach a class based on what I had seen other people do. So I had to invent it, which was a lot of fun. I was like, okay, I'm going to teach these things my way. And, I realized that I had spent a ton of effort self-teaching, and that I was at a point there where I could start sharing it. So that early teaching experience kind of laid the framework for me to teach Odyssey eventually, and Do You See What I See, and Most Important Picture projects in a variety of different countries around the world.
Well, that was one of the things that I liked about your teaching style for Odyssey, and I'm glad you brought up that the teaching experience in a public schools through SEPA, and that you had to invent how you taught the class because you'd never been to a photography class. So that really translated for me, because it wasn't, when we took the workshop, it wasn't like, here's what your aperture value should be and shutter speeds and lighting. It was more, like you said, your mother's work was lyrical. It was more about, there was writing involved in some of the exercises, and it really was something way different than anything that I would have expected out of a photography class. So I think that's a really powerful example of, you don't need to go to school for everything. Sometimes learning how to do things on your own is going to help you develop your own voice, which you certainly have. And so that's kind of how you got started in teaching photography. How did you land gigs doing photojournalist work overseas in some of these austere places?
How did the work abroad start? Actually, around the time I picked up the camera, my mom, her condition had progressed a lot, and she had actually gone through a really long process of kind of considering whether or not there were medical improvements coming for multiple sclerosis or not. And she and I went to a whole variety of doctors and specialists, really with the idea of, is there hope that this can change at some point in her lifetime? And the answer was no. So she had actually planned to end her life. And I had planned to be there with her for that process. I kind of did a lot of deep thinking and realized, like, my job is to be there for my mom in whatever way she needs me at that point in time, not to demand that she be here for me in the way that I needed her. There'd been a role reversal.
Sure.
And, in the end, she decided not to do it. And at that point, I was, again, kind of exhausted, depressed, and decided that I was going to start doing the things that I needed to do, and also not be the sole caregiver for her, to try and, I realized I needed to find a team to help me. That opened up space for me to do some traveling. And, having somebody who could help with the caregiving allowed me to travel. My first trip was to Italy. And then I traveled to Ireland, and she encouraged it. Shortly after that, she ended up in a nursing home, and kind of said, you know what, you've been here for me. I'm good now. I'm taken care of. Go out and see the world and bring it back. So I'd go on a trip, I'd save some money, paint a house, save some money, and go out and photograph. And at first, those photographic trips were like kind of connected to my ethnic heritage, so it was Italy, Ireland, and then I ended up going to Romania, where I did a project on deinstitutionalization and was invited to create a workshop for kids who were HIV positive. So I taught HIV positive kids in this small post-industrial Romanian town on a river, with the promise that we would exhibit the work here, but not in Romania. We had the exhibit at SEPA Gallery, there was a ton of press coverage about it at the time, and I shared that press coverage with the kids in Romania, pre-internet days. And they were amazed and felt really empowered by the process.
Of course.
So they said, you know what, bring the exhibit to Bucharest. Not to Georgiou, the town that they were from, but to Bucharest. And in Bucharest, you know, their pictures and their exhibit was really well received. They showed their work on World AIDS Day, and their condition had been, you know, kind of a secret. And they're a secret sometimes to them, but definitely they were a secret, and their story was living in silence. And then the next year after that, they had the exhibit in their hometown and walked on World AIDS Day in a march that their families had organized. And it was amazing to see kind of the empowerment of showing work, of having work in the press so that it's amplified, really amplified into communities. It's not just on the walls of a museum where 100 people see it.
Right.
It's on TV or newspapers or radio where, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are seeing it. And that amplification of their work, you know, became an important kind of tenet in the process that I use in teaching. So, you know, I bring my own experiences to teaching, and then I kind of watch what happens and how people use what I throw at them and how they make it their own. And often I'll integrate, you know, the wisdom or the discoveries of the students so that they become part of the process. And as you know, with Odyssey, we did a major exhibit in a book, and part of that is because I saw the power of that with these kids in Romania.
Right.
So from there, working with HIV positive kids, I was invited to, and I wasn't invited, I actually put together a grant proposal to ASMP, Association of Media Photographers, or American Society of Media Professionals. I don't even know what the acronym means anymore. And, you know, I got like $1,500. I asked some friends who worked for camera companies, like, can you donate some cameras or film? And I brought a bunch of film, a bunch of cameras, and paid for my ticket and went to Kenya to teach kids who had lost their parents to HIV. So the intention was to use photography and photo education to allow people who were dealing with the consequences of HIV, either through their own personal health or having lost their parents, to show and share their stories on a global level. There's just like misadventures in there.
Sure.
You know, I went to Uganda to teach, and I was working in a border town, collaborating with a woman who had been basically a young, beautiful gun runner during Museveni's time when he was fighting to take over the country. But she was connected to one of his rivals who was killed by Museveni as they approached Kampala.
So you're in a tricky spot.
So I was in a tricky spot because it was an election year, and I was working with somebody who was perceived to be an enemy of Museveni because of this long historical stuff.
Sure.
You know, I get kind of arrested, interrogated, and it's blowing my mind. I'm like, I'm just here to teach some HIV orphans, AIDS orphans, photography, and now I'm being interrogated. Like, you know, so I had a book of the Romanian work, I had a book of the kids' work from Romania, and I'm sitting across from a CID officer named Moses, and, you know, I'm like answering all of his questions, staying really calm, kind of channeling my caregiving experience so that I'm not panicking or freaking out. I'm
just
like,
de-escalating the whole
I've been
time.
in worse situations than this, you know, taking care of my mom. Like, this is cool. I can get through it, stayed calm. So like, you know, 12 hours of talking to these government officials about this stuff. And at a certain point, I kind of saw Moses soften a little bit, and I was like, all right, this is when I take out the book. I was like, you know, I'm So Moses, I'm really confused. Like, I came here to teach kids who were affected by HIV, and now I'm sitting here being interrogated basically by the secret police. Like, and can you just help me understand that process? You seem like a really nice guy. This is what I came to do, and that's when I pulled out the book from Romania. He starts reading it, and he starts crying. And he says, "Can I keep this book?" And I said, "Sure, but can I ask you why?" He said, "Well, my kids would be those kids that you're here to teach, but your government is providing HIV medication to police officers and security officers in Uganda, and because of that, I'm alive and my son is alive. So I can tell you this, Brenden, come back and I'll ensure your security personally." And I was like, all right, I'm coming back. So I ended up leaving, meeting the Minister of Immigration in Kampala, and then I heard that the town got really mad at this district commissioner and went to Kampala and sat in the president's office until they could get a hearing and said, this knucklehead is ruining an opportunity for our most vulnerable kids. So the district commissioner who created all these problems for me got kind of summoned to Kampala, and I went in and taught the class to those kids while he was getting chewed out in Kampala.
That's awesome.
And the kids were like, "Yeah, you're back. We never thought we'd see you again." Because I had started the workshop, and when I was meeting the Minister of Immigration, she's like, "As a mother, I'm going to approve this, but also as a mother, I have to ask you, could you do this someplace you'd be more comfortable?"
Almost like your mother.
I said, "Well, I could, but I've already met these kids and promised them this experience, and if they've had their families stolen from them, I don't want to promise them something and then take it back.
Right.
With your permission, I'm going back to Busia to teach this group of kids." So that's kind of where my work in the developing world started. After that workshop, I just kind of found purpose and opportunity in Kenya and throughout Africa. And I worked there for about 10 years.
It's a lot more exciting than cutting corners and painting walls all day, I'd imagine. Did you only do interior painting when you were a house painter?
No, I started with 44-foot wood ladders.
Oh, boy. Okay, so photography, just getting interrogated in Uganda, it's a little more exciting, even though a little more dangerous. You're not on a 40-foot rickety ladder on a steep roof in Buffalo in the wintertime,
Yeah.
spring or fall or
But
something.
I think the same principles, for me, when I started my painting business, I hired people, who were recovering alcoholics. I hired people who needed a job to do the right thing by their family. And my partner, Joe Agro, and I kind of treated the business as social work. It was
Sure.
Or as community, not necessarily even social work.
Yeah, community, I think, just knowing you, I think community is a better sense of what that was about.
But it was community for people who were really vulnerable, and community for people who are really struggling.
So that through line that's been a part of you throughout, like photography and art aside. That's how you ran your painting business, but it's a really cool way to carry a teaching modality, as community instead of like a job or a career. You know what I'm saying?
Thanks.
I think the approach of a career can destroy a lot of things that are in art or around the fringes of the creative community. Like Julian, who helped lead the first Odyssey workshop, Chinana, he's on another episode of Birds in the Sky. But he was talking about how his experience of going to UB for photography, he already had a career. So he wasn't going to school to learn a career. He was going to school to learn something he was passionate about. and that translates in his work. You know, he's not out there trying to get into the Guggenheim and have serious discussions of gear and lighting and stuff. He's out there making work because it makes him feel good. And that seems to kind of be your thing too, is you're approaching photography through a community lens. And I respect that tremendously, because the art world really does bore me. You know, the traditional gallery kind of art world is super boring. So thanks for bringing all the fresh takes
Absolutely.
to photography. Okay, so we're in Uganda. How did you find your way into the Middle East then?
Yeah, so from there, what ended up happening, and I said earlier, you know, my career has been defined, career as you can call it, has been defined by kind of stopping in the middle of the right mistakes.
Yes.
And not that going to Uganda to teach was a mistake, it was very intentional. But what I found when I was there was, you know, I had landed in a place that was very different than Buffalo, New York. I landed in a place where international media, international aid organizations, and really profound issues were all coalescing. And in Nairobi, I found a media hub. I found that the United Nations and other aid organizations were there and were creating opportunities, or had opportunities for documentary photographers to do meaningful work. I actually did my first work documenting like international health work while I was outside of Uganda waiting for the opportunity to come back in. So I positioned myself on the Kenyan border working with Doctors Without Borders. I met somebody at a party. They were the communications officer for Doctors Without Borders. I said, put me to work. What can I do? You know, I'm working on HIV stories with these kids. If you have any projects I can document, I'm happy to volunteer my time. So I volunteered my time there, showed the work that I made to people I had met, you know, just friends of friends that I had made, and was invited to have an exhibit of the work I did documenting Doctors Without Borders work in the deepest kind of bush areas where, you know, you'd ride a bicycle and hike for 3 hours to reach people who were HIV positive to provide medicine. So that was the core of the story that I did for them. That was the core of the exhibit that I had at the United Nations headquarters in Nairobi. And after that exhibit, like UNICEF Somalia invited me to work. I went on a month-long kind of trip with UNICEF throughout Somalia, documenting all these different things that were happening there and the work that they were doing. I started getting more opportunities with Doctors Without Borders, and I didn't leave Kenya for about 5 or 6 years.
Oh, wow. You were in Kenya that long?
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Did you pick up any of the language or anything like that?
I picked up like 5 or 6 phrases in about 25 different languages.
Yeah.
And every time I'd learn to say something in one language, I'd learn to say it in another language.
Sure,
and it
sure.
would just be a confusion for me. So I'm not very linguistically adept.
No, that's fun though. Spending time in other places is important for
It was
growth.
amazing. I mean, it was really amazing. And it was, the most amazing thing about it was I had an opportunity to do meaningful work. You know, while I was photographing challenging stories, famine, the consequences of war and disaster, working in Doctors Without Borders clinics in South Sudan, and elsewhere, you know, photographing people who were injured in battle, kids who were, you know, hurt as a consequence of war going on in their areas. Like, that was all work that I was doing, and I was able to make photographs that I felt were meaningful and contributing to some sort of betterment. And it's great to be able to at least ask yourself, am I doing important work? Does the work I have meaning?
Absolutely.
And, you know, you wrestle with the answer to that question, but the question was always relevant, and so I knew I was in the right place. From there, All right, so I'm working as a photojournalist at this point, and as a documentary photographer, and I put the teaching work aside because that had largely been volunteer.
Sure.
United Nations High Commission for Refugees put out a call for proposals looking for someone to teach in refugee camps, and I applied. I put together a whole proposal, and it was accepted, and that became a project called Do You See What I See? I worked in Namibia with Angolan refugees, Rwandan refugees. There's a small refugee camp in Namibia that was kind of a catchment for people who had fled different wars throughout Africa and ended up in southern Africa. And that project ended up being exhibited in the United Nations headquarters in New York City, which was amazing.
Yeah, that's outstanding.
Also, it was exhibited in each of the refugee camps that I worked in.
Sure.
And it was exhibited in the capital cities where those refugee camps were. So the kids were able to kind of see their work and go, to Windhoek in Namibia to see their work at UN headquarters there. And so again, kind of braiding in that process to the teaching. From there, eventually that same project was, I was invited to reprise that project in Lebanon and then in Jordan, working with Syrian refugees.
Oh, what year was that?
It was 2014.
Okay.
So it was 11 years ago.
All right.
And today I'm watching those kids that I've stayed in touch with. Now they're 25, 26, 27-year-old adults. At the time they were 16, 17-year-old teenagers. And since the fall of Assad, they've been making their way back. So I'm actually watching them post videos and photographs that they've made.
That's amazing. Some of them are
to
still
Facebook
making pictures.
and Instagram. Yep.
That's outstanding, man. That's got to feel amazing.
A couple of them are working as photographers.
What does that feel like?
It feels great, man.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Super proud, huh?
I have to say.
Yeah,
I'm
you
proud
should,
of them.
You
Like,
should be, for sure,
you know,
man. I mean, that's incredible. What an opportunity. Now they have the ability and means to tell their own stories and the power to do so. So this is kind of like, Odyssey started in 2019, correct? The Odyssey workshops. So between 2014, 2019, I'm sure is a lot of trying to get Odyssey off the ground and get funding for that, or is there another play in between there?
So the idea for Odyssey was sparked when I came back to the States. I lived in Kenya for 5 years. I came back around 2010. I fell in love. I decided to stay. And I built my family with the woman that I met at that time here in Buffalo. And when I arrived, I was like, I wanted to keep doing the teaching work that I had begun to do in Uganda and throughout the world. So I needed to figure out how to do that. I had a mentor when I started photography named Joe Orfeo. He's a painter. He's a World War II vet. He piloted amphibious landing vehicles in the South Pacific. He saw a lot of stuff happen. He dealt with the consequences of what he saw and what that did to him emotionally through painting. And when I was at that point that I had described earlier, where I could walk into a room and not remember how to paint it, he was there. And I said, Joe, did you ever have a feeling like you get to a point where you're not sure who you are anymore, and you know you're not who you used to be, and you never know if you're going to be able to get back to that? And he was like, yep.
Yeah, I know all about that.
I know that one. And I said, well, what do you do? He said, you keep going. You express yourself, you get creative. He said, make art. I said, do you get to be the person you were again? He said, no, but you get to be part of that person. Part of that person comes back, and part of you is going to be new again.
That's amazing.
But he kind of mapped it out for me. Sure. It was like, without at that time talking about trauma and PTSD and all these other things. He was like, yeah, you get creative. Like, and as you create and act and move through, you start to find the mechanisms to heal yourself. You start to find the connections that help you heal. And so I just kind of followed his wisdom and advice. And when I got back from Kenya, fell in love with my wife, Jenny, I remembered Joe's advice, and I was like, you know what, I want to pay this forward. And we didn't have, here we didn't have the same issues that my work was addressing when I was abroad. So I thought it'd be a good idea to try and create a photography program that leaned on the same things that I learned in my own experience and in witnessing my students around the world, and build it for combat veterans as a way of paying Joe Orfeo forward. So that's when the kind of seeds of Odyssey were planted. But that was 2010, and it took 9 years to get it off the ground.
Right. Did you have any expectations working with veterans as to how they would receive this kind of thing, a permission to express themselves through art and creativity? Do you have any expectations of how veterans would kind of navigate that?
I mean, I had seen the methodology that I was developing and using work for me as a house painter and caregiver. I'd seen the methodology work with kids who were HIV positive, so in a medical context, with refugee kids and youth in different contexts, and with kids who were traumatized having lost their parents. So I think at that point I kind of recognized that the modality should work universally, and that really a respectful, curious, and safe environment for people to talk about what they've seen, what they've done, what they've lost, what they've gained through some of the most challenging experiences of life would be an opportunity that people in almost any circumstance could embrace and use to thrive. So I had a lot of confidence that that I was creating a program and an approach that would be meaningful to people in their lives. It was inspired by Joe Orfeo, who was, one of the most creative, one of the fiercest, and one of the most optimistic and loving people that I knew in my life. And if I was building something to pay him forward, it would hopefully carry some of that spirit. And, knowing that art making had transformed his life coming out of war, I was pretty confident that this would be a valuable experience, and that people would find a way to embrace it. Maybe not right away, but in the process, definitely. It's also voluntary, so people who are coming in are like, oh shit, that might be something that'll be good for me. It was a huge commitment. You were asked to commit 12 weeks to this process, 3 months as a young father.
Yeah, it was challenging, but it wasn't like a choice though. It was like, I need to do this. This is good for me, especially after the first few go rounds. It was like, okay, I really need this. It was way better than any kind of therapy. I'm not saying don't go to therapy, but for me, it was just a lot better way to kind of do that. And Steve Schultz, who's been on the podcast, talked about like, he can show you pictures about stuff he doesn't want to talk about, and what are some surprising things about the veteran community that you might have learned, or insights that you didn't have previously?
I think the one thing I was afraid of kind of coming in was, I had worked mostly with kids and young people, and I had worked with people who had a lot of time. In a refugee camp, you've got time. And, so I was worried a little bit working with older people who had been through life, that they may have gotten hardened by their experiences and not ready to be open or trusting of the process that I was going to lay out. And I also worried a lot about what I saw in the other contexts where I taught is that people benefited a lot from the group, from being in a group and creating together. And I wasn't sure how I would be able to create a group out of a bunch of veterans. So the first thing when you all arrived at Camp Pioneer and started talking, I was like, holy shit, these guys know how to make a group. Like, and I was so relieved.
Unit cohesion, you didn't even have to do anything.
No, it just happened. Like you guys, not organically, but
Yeah.
through tons of training and experience, knew how to connect with each other. And I think the other thing I witnessed was you were immediately in an environment where you could share stories that you might not be able to tell people in the normal course of your life. And so those were the two kind of early hallelujah, this is going to work moments, and address the fears that I did have going in. I was confident, but I was still scared that it wasn't going to work. And what happens if it doesn't work? What happens to the people that I invited in if I'm inviting them in to participate in something that's going to be more trouble than benefit? Those were probably my most deep-seated anxieties about it. But they were assuaged really quickly in the first 20 minutes of people talking to each other. I was like, all right, these guys know each other already.
Right. That's one of the benefits of even just getting veterans together. They without needing to make art or being a workshop, just getting us together, because we're spread out. We're less than 2% of the population. So once we get into the community, we're kind of like, we never know where each other are. I saw a funny meme that veterans wear veteran hats not to tell everybody that they're a veteran. It's so that we can find each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember that. We all kind of sat in this room and the stories just started immediately, because there's like a baseline trust, I think is what it comes down to with the veteran community. And yeah, do you have any really solid impact stories as the facilitator of this workshop that for members that have come through and found like a hugely transformational experience for them? I mean, I know from speaking to a lot of the guys that I went to the cohort, we all had real profound experiences, but on your end, does any of the members stand out as having like a, wow, I'm glad this person came into the workshop kind of moment? Without playing favorites, I just mean from an emotional
I could sit here and tell you stories for you got another 3 episodes.
Yeah.
But I think also I encourage anybody who's listening to this to listen to the other episodes, because you've got Julian Chinana, you've got
Melissa,
Steve Schultz, you've got Melissa Amaker.
More are coming as well.
More are coming, and those are people that can kind of really tell you those stories from their own perspective. I've been working, so we had our introductory retreat at, wait a minute, I'm trying to figure out how to tell this because there are so many different ways. My day today coming in here, I was woken up with a phone call from Mike Shanley, who was in...
He was in my cohort.
He was in your cohort.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked for about 25, 30 minutes about Odyssey, about him being traumatized and triggered, seeing some of Julian's work early on in the process, about Joe Rizala, a Vietnam veteran, who came up to me when he saw Mike upset by some of the graphic images that Julian had shared, and basically put his finger in my face and was like, what the fuck do you think you're doing? I got a good man over here who's going down because he's surprised to see these pictures and wasn't prepared for it. He spent 13 years getting those things out of his head, and now he came here to learn about photography and he has them in his head. And I actually brought that up with Mike this morning, and he was like, yeah, it's all good, man. There were a lot of things going on at that time, and if that were to happen today, what happened then would prepare me to deal with it a lot better. And, it was good having Joe have my back like that. But also, what we did in response was stop the class. I went out and talked to Mike for about an hour, probably. I didn't talk to him. I went out and listened to Mike for about an hour. You know, what I thought about is, when I'm really upset, what do I need from somebody? You know, do I need them to tell me to calm down? Do I need them to tell me it's going to be okay? Or do I need them to open up space to hear what I'm going through? And you know, my response to him was like, I'm not here to defend any of this from happening. I'm here to be open to what he's going through. And we talked for a long time. And you know, I said, I understand if you leave. I hope you stay. And he decided to stay. And he's become a kind of champion of Odyssey in the years since. He called me last week to go out photographing this Sunday with another Odyssey member. You know, so the way that that kind of beautiful community was formed in the first minutes that I just talked about, fast forward 5 years later, and it's become integrated into my life too. You guys are part of my life. Like, it's not a class that ended.
Right, we were shooting at Delaware Park a couple of weeks ago.
So that's, I mean, that's been an amazing kind of surprise. And yeah, I mean, I think there are other folks. Before we started, Rob Healy called me. Rob and I were talking on the beach in front of Camp Pioneer when our workshop started. And he said, you know what, like, I work a shitty government job, and I want to be working in arts at some point. Last year, Rob quit his job at Social Security Administration and went back to school using veteran benefits, and he's getting a master's in social work because he wants to be able to work in arts and therapy and counseling. You know, so that's an amazing kind of transformation that was catalyzed, I think, by his experiences in Odyssey.
Yeah, that's amazing. And just real quick, back to Shanley and that whole thing. There was a part of the Odyssey Project that dictated that there was a mental health person available, right? Because I think you had the foresight to know that this could conjure up some feelings and emotions in people that they might have, you know, suppressed for a while. So good on you for doing that as well. But just a note that you're doing it the right way.
Well, I think, you know, the wisdom of the group addresses most of that stuff.
Sure.
But we've really been lucky to have Jim Becker, who's a vet center counselor and a veteran himself, as the kind of guy on standby for anybody who needs to talk about things or to work through things therapeutically. And one of the only prerequisites was that you have to be engaged in an ongoing therapeutic relationship somewhere. So if you're coming in, you know, you have to have a counselor that you can work on anything that comes up through Odyssey with.
Yeah, it's important. It's important. So, Brenden, I think we've got it. Do you have anything else? Like, Odyssey's still going right now, correct? It's actually expanded into the New York City market?
Yep. So Odyssey is running still in Buffalo, New York, in partnership at SEPA Gallery with funding from Foundation 214. Odyssey has been, we're in our third year of running Odyssey in partnership with Josephine Herrick Project and the Queens Vet Center in New York City. We've got a 20-person retreat and 2 classes coming up there in March 2025. We're planning another workshop in Buffalo, and 2 of the veterans who commuted from Rochester, New York, about an hour and a half each way to take part in a 12-week Odyssey course have are creating an opportunity and advocating for us to start a chapter there in Rochester for the veterans community in Rochester.
Well, that's great. I support that. I feel like this should be in every city in America. It was a huge resource for me and a bunch of my knucklehead buddies to get our heads right, our minds right. Brenden, Bannon, thanks for coming by, man.
Thank
I
you,
really
Matt.
appreciate it. Thanks for stopping by and listening to Birds in the Sky. I am your host, Matthew Crane. Like, subscribe, share. Please keep this show going. Thanks a lot.